Japan's military leadership and people believed in the racial superiority of their nation and culture. Literally everyone else was inferior in intelligence, spirit, and will. Their early victories in China and over colonial troops in Southeast Asia and American and Filipino troops reinforced this belief. All these cultures and their troops would fall before the Bushido Code of the Japanese. Early in the war, Japanese soldiers were bombarded with imperial propaganda. Propaganda which portrayed Americans as soft and cowards, soldiers that didn't have the will to fight a prolonged war, unlike the Japanese. They believed that the Americans were used to living their lives in great comfort and luxury, and that their spirit would break once these were gone. But you see, propaganda has a funny way of colliding with reality and losing. To the Japanese, the Americans lacked the discipline and will. And if they lived such soft lives, how could they possibly endure the hardships of war? Early in the war, Japanese morale was boosted thanks to their early wins, and they expected to deliver a crucial blow during their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. However, far from diminishing American morale, it did pretty much the contrary. American factories started producing at a rate that Japan couldn't even dream about matching. The Japanese themselves already had issues within their own structure. Logistics were pretty much poorly efficient at best, not to mention the rivalry between the army and the navy. They were spreading themselves too thin and were becoming unable to supply their troops correctly. This would eventually get much worse with essentially the decimation of the Japanese navy by 1944. The tables had turned for Japan, and by then, they were fighting a purely defensive war. It wasn't about conquering new territories anymore, but rather about not losing more territory to the Americans. Their infamous Banzai charges were not being efficient anymore like they had been in China. The main reason is because Chinese soldiers mainly operated bolt-action rifles and just couldn't deal with the hundreds and hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging towards them. Banzai charges proved to be very effective in China, but against the well-armed Americans, it was just collective suicide. Their opponent, who was once believed to be soft, was giving them a masterclass on why you should never underestimate your enemies. Americans proved to have the fight in them, and to be way more adaptable than expected. Not to mention, American logistics was something the world just hadn't seen before. It went as far as having a ship dedicated to supplying ice cream to soldiers on the front lines. Yeah, the ice cream ship was a thing. This just comes to show us the immense industrial power the US had. To the Japanese, this was demoralizing. They survived pretty much on meager rations. Some regiments even had to resort to farming and being self-sufficient. As most of the soldiers were farmers, they started on taking a role of being self-sufficient since their empire couldn't even supply them with rice. Many of them didn't even die fighting, but of malnutrition and diseases due to also a lack of medical supplies. However, this was something they endured and still kept their fighting spirits till the bitter end, which is admirable. Surrender was just not an option by any means. This also shaped their treatments of POWs, deeming them as dishonorable. Since they chose to surrender, they were just inferior beings. A particular target of Japanese propaganda was the US Marines. They were portrayed as monsters that would eat the skulls of their enemies and impale them to burn the remains. This actually instilled fear in the Japanese soldiers, as they thought they were up against beasts, not men. Soldiers were told that Marines were recruited from the worst corners of American society, prisons and mental asylums. These tales, aside from instilling terror, were also designed to fortify the resolve of never surrendering and fighting till the very last man. By the end of the war, the views on Americans had drastically changed. Shaped by the harsh realities of combat, they learned that you must never underestimate your opponent.